Good afternoon. This is the third lecture of MGT568, Difference and Leadership, and we're into week 4. So first of all, I'd like to apologise for the service disruption and for the replacement of this video for that, but it was unavoidable, so I do apologise. So today we're going to cover topic 4 and topic 5, social identity and leadership, and gender and leadership. And as you know, I always like to put some pictures up, and I've got a really lovely picture here of Kathy Freeman because I think she kind of embodies a whole range of things with regards to this. So she has a particular social identity because of her standing in the sports community, because she won the Olympic Games, etc., and she's a leader in that arena, because she's an Indigenous leader, and also she's a female. So we cross over all of those things. So as you always know, I like to start off with questions as a starting point, and I want you to think of these as we go through today. So how do we know who we are, and how do others identify us? How do our senses of ourselves as unique individuals square with the realization that always and everywhere we share aspects of our identity with many others? And how can we reconcile our routine sense of ourselves as consistently who we are with the knowledge that we can be different things to different people in different circumstances? And finally, to what extent is it possible to become someone or something other than what we now are? And is it possible to just be myself? So this is out of the readings by Richard Jenkins. So I've given you the link to Richard Jenkins' book, which is a very good book about social identity and leadership, and specifically chapter 1 and chapter 2 for this week. But these questions are really big questions, but very important questions that you should be looking at and using to frame this subject and this particular topic as well. And finally, also from last week, what is leader identity and how does it interface with our other social identities? So our social identities are quite often made up of who we are out of work, what our background was, what groups we're in, and it's intersected with our gender, our ethnicity, etc. So these are really big questions, but very important questions for you to be answering. And I put a picture up of Stan Grant because I think his social identity has really evolved, and we see him in the 1980s as a young man, and he started off, I think he was with SBS, and he went on to work for a whole range of different organisations, obviously media, mostly in the television arena, but his identity has evolved. His identity is he's much more proud now to be an Indigenous man, advocating for Indigenous issues, and is an Indigenous leader, and his social identity is very much formed by that. But it's also formed by where he comes from. He comes from Cootamundra, a regional country town in New South Wales. He comes from a family of possibly disadvantaged. His father, Stan Grant, also, he's very well known in the Indigenous community. He's a pillar of that, and he actually holds a lot of the Wiradjuri language. But his social identity is also made up of his being in the media as well. So I urge you to look at the video for this week, the video I put in about Stan Grant, because it'll start you to get you thinking about other people's stories and other people's social identities. So the main ideas for this week come from Richard Jenkins, social identity, and he defines 3 different things. First of all, identity denotes the ways in which individuals and collectivities are distinguished in their relations with other individuals and collectivities. So it's how we relate individually and collectively with others, individually and collectively. So it's about relationship. It's socially constructed. Okay, then identification. So how we are identified is the systematic establishment and signification between individuals, between collectivities, between individuals and collectivities of relationships of similarity and difference. So we're bringing in the similarity and difference now, okay, which moves on to the next thing. And this can be taken as they can only be together. So similarity and difference are the dynamic principles of identification and are at the heart of the human world. So similarity and difference have to be taken together, and they are dynamic principles of our identity and of identification, and they are at the heart of the human world. So I also give you this quote from Simmel, and Jenkins unpacks a whole range of theory with regards to social identity. The practical significance of men for one another is determined by both similarities and differences among them. Similarity as fact or tendency is no less important than difference. In the most varied forms, both are the great principles of all internal and external development. In fact, the cultural history of mankind can be conceived as the history of the struggles and conciliatory attempts between the two. So, if you are struggling with this subject, difference and leadership, you're not alone. And it's important that you are struggling, because you're trying to reconcile similarity and difference. You're trying to identify your identity, to work out where you sit, where others sit, and how that plays out for you in your leadership. So I want you to stop and reflect and spend some time with this. What do these insights into difference, and in particular into similarity and difference and leadership, mean for your leadership? I've put for leadership, but for your leadership. So what do these insights into difference and leadership, into similarity and difference, mean for your leadership? So I want you to stop and reflect on that. So continuing on, Chin and Trimble in Chapter 4 clearly articulate social identity as well. So they talk about the social categories and context within which a leader shapes their identity and the power to which they are accorded. And a lot of you have identified that in your digital identity stories, which I'm really enjoying viewing. That your categorization of the social category and the context where you come from shape your identity and the power which you are given as well. And some of you obviously can see that you've been given more power, much more power than others, whereas others have been very courageous and have identified where you feel that you haven't been afforded that power. And Chin and Trimble gives some very good examples of bicultural leaders and those from minorities, and make the really strong point that they have to continually prove themselves. Diverse leaders from coloured backgrounds are more likely to practice collective leadership than individuals. That's a research finding that they've come up with. And they have a high respect for humility, dignity, lack of vanity, deference to the group's welfare, and functioning from a self-effacing demeanour in a gracious, respectful and polite manner. So diverse leaders from coloured backgrounds are much more likely to sit in this, be like this. So I want you now to stop and reflect. And this is really important. I want you to think about a leader from a diverse background, either in Australia or overseas. I want you to write down who that leader is. And then I want you to think about what labels or stories come to mind when you think about them as a leader. So what do you say about them? What are the labels that you give them, and what are the stories that come to mind about them and about maybe others, stories that are evoked for you about them? And if you are a leader from a minority, and this is being very courageous, if you are a leader from a minority, how do you establish your status and legitimacy? So how have you had to establish your status and legitimacy? And how does that affect how your image as well, the image that you have to portray as well? So if you are a leader from a minority group, how have you had to establish your status and legitimacy and your image? And Chin and Trimble talk a lot about Barack Obama as well, and how black people thought he was too white, and white people thought he was black, and all the bits in between. And it reminds me of I've worked a lot with Indigenous people, and quite often this is Indigenous Australians, if they're not very dark, they can be called a coconut, and if they're very dark, they're called something else. And there's stuff that happens in that way as well. And sometimes if they're very white, we can say, oh, they're not really Indigenous. So there's a whole range of things that play out. Or we say they're not really an Indigenous leader, or why do we call them an Indigenous leader? So there's a whole range of spectrums here, and this is what I'm trying to kind of bring home to you as well.